A peaceful village. That is dying. The village where no child was born. There are villages that greet you with noise. The clatter of children chasing each other between market stalls. The shriek of laughter from behind a grandmother's skirt. The sound of small feet on packed earth, running toward nothing and everything at once. Running simply because legs were made for it, and because the world had not yet told them to stop. Atana was not such a village. Atana greeted you with something else entirely. Something harder to name. Not silence exactly. The market still hummed, the women still sang at the river, the men still argued with the particular enthusiasm of men who have been arguing about the same thing for 30 years. The drums still spoke on feast nights. The fires still crackled. The goats still complained. But underneath all of it, woven into the very fabric of the air like smoke that had soaked itself into old cloth, there was an absence. You felt it before you understood it. You would stand at the edge of the village, squinting in the amber light of early morning, and something would nag at the back of your chest. A small hollow feeling. The sense of a word on the tip of the tongue that refused to come. And then, slowly, like a man's eyes adjusting from darkness into firelight, you would begin to see it. No child sat on a doorstep. No infant cried from inside a home. No small fingers reached up to tug at a mother's wrapper. No group of boys competed to throw stones the furthest. No girls plaited each other's hair in the shade and spoke in the breathless, conspiratorial whisper that only young girls understand. There were no children. Not one. And yet, this was the remarkable thing, the thing that would keep you awake later, the thing that crawled under your skin and nested there. Nobody in Atana seemed to find this strange. The women laughed at the river as though children had never existed to laugh beside them. The elders sat in their carved wooden chairs and debated the price of cassava with the same gravity they had always debated it. The young men oiled their muscles and competed in the evening and celebrated their victories as though victory was still something worth celebrating. A whole village going about the entire business of living, without any of the people for whom living is supposed to be continued. A woman named Amara swept her threshold each morning and placed a small clay pot of egusi soup by the door of her compound. A habit, she would say if you asked, a habit from long ago. But no child ever reached for that pot. The soup would sit until it cooled. Until it was covered in flies. Until she emptied it quietly into the earth and prepared another the next morning. Nobody asked her to stop. Nobody asked her why. This was what Atana felt like. A village that had organized itself perfectly around a loss it had decided not to name. The last child born in Atana had arrived 18 years ago. A girl they called Zara. And then, 5 days after her birth, on a morning that the elders still did not speak about in full, Zara was taken back. Not by sickness. Not by accident. By something that had no clean word in any language any elder was willing to offer. After Zara, no woman conceived. Not in 18 years. Atana continued. The crops grew tall and generous. The rains came on time. The elders remained healthy and clear-minded. The young men did not leave for the cities the way young men in other villages had been doing. The soil stayed rich. The cattle stayed fat. The river stayed clean. Everything in Atana worked with a strange, undisturbed perfection, like a clock from which someone had carefully removed the alarm, so that it ticked on forever, beautifully and precisely, into a morning that would never come. A peaceful village. A village that was, by every reasonable measurement, dying. And the question that the village itself refused to ask, the question that hung over every swept threshold and every cooling pot of soup, was not why it was dying. The question was, who had decided that this was the price of peace? There was a man who noticed. His name was Taiwo, and he arrived the way travelers always arrive in the stories that matter. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, but simply by walking until the road brought him somewhere and stopping because his feet were tired. He was a griot's apprentice, 26 years old, sent out from his own village 3 months prior with a sleeping mat, a small carved flute, and a teacher's instruction to go and listen. To collect stories. To sit in the belly of other people's lives until he understood something new about being alive. He had been to 11 villages before Atana. He had never felt anything like this. He sat at the edge of the market on his first afternoon, eating roasted groundnuts from a woman who had charged him a fair price and smiled a careful smile, and he watched. The market was busy enough. Cloth sellers. Grain merchants. A blacksmith's boy polishing iron rings at a stall. Older women with calculating eyes and good-natured insults for anyone who questioned their prices. A man selling caged birds whose song made several women pause and press their hands briefly to their chests before moving on. Normal, Taiwo thought. Entirely normal. Except, he had been sitting there for nearly 2 hours, and in that time, not a single child had passed through the market. Not a single one begged for a piece of groundnut. Not one sat atop a father's shoulders and pointed at bright cloth with wondering fingers. At markets in every village he had visited, children were the weather, always present, always changing the temperature of every interaction. Here, there were none. He asked the groundnut seller, gently, the way you ask when you are not sure you want the answer, "Where do the children play?" The woman's smile did not disappear. It simply changed, in a way that smiles sometimes do when they stop being true. Became smoother. More deliberate. "There is a good well at the center of the village," she said. "You will sleep well tonight. The air here is clean." She had answered a question he had not asked. He noted this. That night, he stayed in a compound at the village edge, offered to him by an older man named Kwesi, who had the deliberate hospitality of someone who had practiced it for many years until it required no thought. The compound was large. Clean. There were 4 separate sleeping rooms off the central courtyard. "Your family?" Taiwo asked, gesturing at the rooms. "My brothers lived here," Kwesi said. "Long ago." He did not say where the brothers were now. In the courtyard, Taiwo noticed something he filed away carefully, the way a good listener files things before he knows what they mean. Along the base of the eastern wall, someone had planted a row of oji trees, kola nut trees, small and carefully tended. 8 of them, evenly spaced, each with a smooth river stone at its base. The stones were worn, touched often. He counted the trees again. 8. In most traditions he knew, kola trees were planted to mark births. 1 tree per child born into a compound. He looked at the windows of the 4 empty sleeping rooms. 8 trees. 4 rooms. No sounds from within. He played his flute softly until sleep arrived, but it did not arrive quickly. By the 3rd day, Taiwo had catalogued 12 things that did not fit. Every compound he had been permitted to enter had at least one section that appeared sealed. Not locked, but sealed. Doorways plastered over with fresh clay, as though the room itself had been swallowed. In one compound, he saw the edge of a painted design beneath the clay, half submerged, a child's handprint in faded red ochre. The river ran clean, but along its northern bank, where silt had built up over years into a small natural shelf, there were depressions in the mud. Small, round, the exact shape of a child's footprint. But they were old, bone dry, and nothing new had been pressed into the mud beside them. He watched the young women of the village. They were there, healthy and bright-eyed, laughing in the easy way of women who enjoy each other's company. But he noticed, after a time, that not one of them spoke about the future in the way that young people in other places did. No mention of "when I have children." No, "my mother did it this way, I will do it differently." They spoke only of what was, never of what would be. He noticed that the oldest people in Atana moved with a curious lack of urgency, not laziness, but something more unsettling. The patience of people who no longer expected change. He noticed that the night watchman, a lean and quiet man named Dunlodi, walked his rounds with particular attention paid to the homes of younger women, stopping outside doors, listening, moving on. He noticed that the medicine woman, whom everyone in the village called simply Mama Sua, sat each morning at the exact same spot outside her compound with a clay bowl of water in her lap, staring into it for an hour before she rose and went about her day. No one thought this unusual. No one commented on it at all. Each of these things answered nothing. Each of them asked something new. On the fifth day, the elders called him. He had expected this. In every village, the elders eventually called the stranger who had been watching too carefully. What varied was what they chose to show him, and what they chose to hide. They met in the council house, 7 of them arranged in the half-circle that meant this is formal, but we are choosing to be kind about it. Old men and 1 old woman, the woman being Mama Sua, who sat at the far end with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed somewhere just past Taiwo's left shoulder. The eldest, a man called Bako, 90 years or close to it, with a particular stillness of someone who had already made every important decision they would ever make, spoke first. "You have good eyes," Bako said. "A griot's eyes. You see what is missing." "I see it," Taiwo agreed. "I do not understand it." Bako nodded slowly, as though the admission were payment enough to begin. He told Taiwo about the curse. His voice carried the cadence of a story told many times, the careful rhythm of something rehearsed into smoothness, all the rough edges worn away by repetition. A great offense, generations back. A wrong done to a spirit of the earth. An anger that manifested as this, the closing of the womb. A village sealed against its own continuation as punishment for what the ancestors had done. The other elders watched Taiwo as Bako spoke. Not with grief. Not with shame. With something closer to attention, the way you watch someone to see if they will be satisfied by an answer. Taiwo listened. He asked the questions a visitor was supposed to ask. He expressed the sympathy a visitor was supposed to express. He thanked them for their honesty. He walked back to Kwesi's compound slowly, watching his own feet. The story was smooth. Too smooth. Every element fit. Every question the elders might have anticipated had been pre-answered within the telling, sealed off before it could be asked. And Bako had described the original offense with a slight vagueness of ancient history, something about a river and a sacrifice and an ancestor whose name no one remembered clearly anymore. But there was something Bako had not mentioned. He had not mentioned Zara. 18 years ago, a child had been born. If the curse had sealed the womb before that, if the offense was ancient and the punishment generational, then why had Zara arrived at all? Why had the womb opened, once, after years of closure, and then closed again, more completely, after? The elder had spoken of the curse as though it were a lock applied long ago. He had not explained the key that had briefly turned it, and then vanished. Taiwo sat in the empty courtyard and counted the kola nut trees again. 8. He stayed quiet until night fell. Then he went to find Amara, the woman with the pot of egusi soup. Amara was 42 years old, and she had been beautiful once in the way that some women are beautiful. Not architecturally, not in a way that strangers gasped at, but in the particular way of a woman fully at home in her own body. That ease was mostly gone now. What remained was something more interesting and more painful, a woman who had decided, very precisely, how much of herself she was allowed to want. She let Taiwo sit across the fire from her. She did not ask why he had come. She poured him palm wine and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He asked her to tell him about Zara. The fire between them breathed. "They will tell you the curse," she said finally. "They have already told you, yes?" "Yes. It is not a lie," she said. "That is the cruelty of it. It is not a lie." She was pregnant with Zara at 24. Her first. Her husband Kalechi had been joyful in the enormous, slightly undignified way of first-time fathers who have not yet learned to contain themselves. He had already named the child 4 times and bought a bolt of new cloth and argued passionately with his own mother about the proper way to prepare the naming day feast. The pregnancy had moved through its months like a normal pregnancy, the sickness and the swelling and the turning dreams and the swollen feet and the hunger. Everything had felt like life arriving. But while Amara's belly grew, Atana had begun to change. Slowly at first. The oldest cattle in the northern pasture became listless and thin. Then they died. One by one, the way old things die, without drama, as though they had simply finished. The oldest Odin tree at the village center, a tree so enormous that 5 men linking arms could not circle it, began dropping branches. Not in storms. On still days. As though something were being subtracted from it. The oldest men in the council, 2 of them, both close to 100, began to fail in the month before Amara's delivery. By the time Zara arrived, 1 had already passed. Everyone thought, coincidence. Old cattle. An old tree. Old men. Zara was born on a Wednesday morning, loud and furious and perfect. By Saturday, the 2nd elder was gone. By the following month, the Odin tree had shed so many branches that the elders convened an emergency council. They called Mama Sua. Mama Sua, who had already known. Who had been watching her clay bowl of water with increasing stillness for the last 9 months, and not said a word. Amara paused here. She looked at her hands. And Zara? Taiwo asked, though he already felt the shape of the answer. Zara lived 5 days, Amara said. And on the 5th day, she left. Her voice did not crack. It was past cracking. It was the voice of a wound that had scar tissue so thick that the original pain was now just a geography. You could map where it had been, but you could not feel it in the same sharp way anymore. After that, she said, no woman here became pregnant. Not in 18 years. And everything else. She gestured outward at the night, at the clean dark air, at the distant sound of the river. Everything else has stayed. She looked at him then, directly. Her eyes were completely clear. Do you understand the rule now? He did. And it was worse than a curse. Whenever new life entered Atana, whenever a child was conceived and carried and brought toward birth, something else in the village died in its proportion. Small life, small death. Large life, large deaths. A baby arriving whole and screaming and full of decades took from the village everything its decades would have cost. The balance demanded it. The earth beneath Atana had been made to work this way. Not as punishment. As mathematics. Taiwo did not sleep. He lay on his mat in the too large compound and stared at the ceiling and turned the mathematics of it over and over. A balance. A living balance. Births cost the village something. In the old days, perhaps, the cost had been small enough. A tree branch, a sickly cow, a season of thin grain, small enough that a child was worth it, obviously and simply worth it, the way new life is always worth something lost. But something had shifted. Something had made the cost catastrophic. Something had turned the natural exchange into a transaction that could not be completed without destroying everything. He went to Mama Sua at dawn. She was already at her spot. The clay bowl in her lap. Her eyes on the water. She did not look up when he sat across from her, which meant she had been expecting him, possibly for longer than he had been in the village. He did not ask her questions. He simply sat. He had learned, from 3 months of collecting stories, that some people need the silence before they can give you the truth. She spoke after 20 minutes, still looking at the water. We were dying, she said. A long time ago. Before you were born, before your father was born. There was a sickness. Atana was emptying. The young died first, and then the strong, and then there was nothing left but the old and the very young, and we all watched each other and waited. The sickness had been a particular one, the kind that moved through a village like a slow fire, taking weeks, taking months, and then taking everything. The elders of that time, Bako's own teachers, the generation above his, had gathered in desperation and made a decision. They had gone to the place in the forest where the earth spirit was known to listen. And they had arranged. They asked for the village to survive, Mama Sua said. They did not specify the terms. The earth spirit's terms were elegant in their cruelty. The village would persist. Sickness would lose its grip. The land would remain fertile. The cattle would stay fat. The rains would be reliable. The people already living would live long and well, and would not be taken by disease or drought or the particular forms of suffering that had been stripping other villages to their bones. The cost, the village's future capacity for new life would be mortgaged against its present survival. Every child brought forward would pull life back out of what existed. The more life a new child represented, the more decades, the more potential, the more Atana would have to give up to balance it. The original elders had, perhaps, believed they would find a solution later. Had perhaps believed that survival now was simply more important than continuity. Had perhaps not fully understood what they were agreeing to. Or perhaps they had understood perfectly. Bako knew this when he spoke to me, Taiwo said. It was not a question. Bako's teacher made the arrangement, Mama Sua said. Bako was 16 when it was made. He has carried it his whole life. He carries it still. And he chose not to tell. She looked up from the bowl for the first time. Her eyes were very old and very steady. He chose what every elder chooses, she said. He chose the living over the not yet born. The village that exists over the village that might exist. Can you say with certainty that he was wrong? She looked back at the water. Taiwo had no answer. He had something worse than an answer. He had a question he could not put down. The elders had made a bargain that kept the living alive at the cost of all future living. They had decided, in a moment of desperation, that existence now outweighed existence forward. And then they had lived inside that decision for decades, maintaining it, protecting it, never dismantling it, because to dismantle it would mean accepting what they had done. The coconut trees stood at the base of Kwesi's eastern wall. 8 trees for the children who had been conceived in the years before the sickness, or perhaps in that terrible gap before the bargain fully took hold. 8 small monuments to children who had arrived and been taken, each time the village bleeding something irreplaceable to balance the books. A village that had chosen to survive. A village that was, by the arithmetic of its own survival, erasing itself. Taiwo asked to speak with the elders again. This time, he did not make his request through Kwesi. He went directly to the council house at mid-morning and sat himself down without being invited, which in Atana was either an insult or a declaration, and he intended it as the latter. They came, one by one. They settled. Bako arrived last. He looked at Taiwo without surprise, without anger. With the expression of a man who had been waiting for this conversation for 18 years and had decided long ago what he would say in it. You know, Bako said. I know, Taiwo said. A long silence in which the fire crackled with tremendous irrelevance. Then say what you have come to say. Taiwo leaned forward. You are trading the village's existence for its survival. These are not the same thing. Are they not? Bako's voice was level, genuinely questioning, not rhetorical. What is a village if not the people living in it? The people here are alive. They are fed, they are housed, they are loved, they are buried with full ceremony. Their lives are whole. You are asking me to grieve for people who do not exist, over people who do. I am asking you to grieve for what Atana becomes when the last of you dies. When there is no one left. Every village ends, said the elder woman to Bako's left, a woman named Folake, who had barely spoken until now. Every village ends eventually. The only question is whether the ending is slow and peaceful or fast and terrible. We chose slow. We chose that the people already here would not be taken by sickness and hunger and the things that were killing us. You chose it for people who could not choose for themselves, Taiwo said. You chose it for Amara. For every woman in this village who will grow old without a child. You made that choice before they were born. Every generation makes choices for the ones that follow, Bako said, and his voice carried something then. Not quite anger, something more complicated than anger. The particular heat of a man who has rehearsed a defense for decades. Your grandfather made choices that shaped your world. The people who built the roads you walked to arrive here made choices you benefit from without knowing. We made a choice in fire and sickness and desperation, and the people of Atana have lived because of it. Long lives. Full lives. Is that nothing? It is not nothing, Taiwo said carefully. It is also not enough. Enough for whom? For the children who were never born. The children who were never born feel nothing, Bako said, and the words were not cruel. They were simply the words of a man who had made himself believe something difficult because believing it was the only way to continue standing upright. The people of Atana feel everything. I chose the ones who feel. Taiwo sat with that. Outside, a woman was singing at the river. Her voice was clear and full and completely unafraid. The voice of someone whose body was fed and safe, and entirely unaware of what it had never been permitted to do. You cannot undo it, Mama Sua said from her corner of the room. She had been so still that Taiwo had half forgotten she was there. Even if you wanted to. The arrangement is not a knot that can be untied. It is a weaving. You pull one thread and you do not know what unravels. Then what? Taiwo asked. You simply continue? Until the youngest person in Atana is 60, and then 70, and then until the last of you dies with no one left to bury them. Yes, Bako said simply. The word fell into the room like a stone into deep water. And you are at peace with that? The old man looked at his hands. Large hands, the hands of someone who had worked hard earth for 9 decades, rough-palmed and steady. No, he said. But peace and choice are not the same thing either. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Taiwo could not say Bako was a monster. He had tried to build the argument that way, and it would not hold. A man who had watched his village empty, who had been 16 years old and surrounded by the dying, who had done the only thing that could be done and then lived inside the consequences of it with full awareness for the rest of his long life. That was not the architecture of a monster. That was the architecture of a tragedy. He could not say Bako was right, either. He sat in the council house long after the elders had gone, and he thought about the woman singing at the river, and the 8 kola nut trees, and the pot of egusi soup cooling on Amara's threshold, and whether it was possible for something to be both a salvation and a sentence, and for there to be no one to blame for either. He had no answer. He did not know yet that by sundown, the question would become unbearably, physically real. He heard it first as a sound from Amara's compound, not a scream, something quieter than that, something almost like its opposite, a held breath finally released, a sound with no name in any language because it was the sound of a woman realizing something enormous and private and world-altering. He was at the market when he heard it. He stopped moving. Then the second sound came, from Mama Sua's compound, the clay bowl of water suddenly shattering from its position on the step with no one near it, as though the water inside had expanded too fast, too hard, too sudden. Taiwo ran. He was not the first to arrive. Dunladi, the night watchman, was already at the edge of Amara's threshold, not crossing it, standing with his hands at his sides and his face the color of ash. Kwesi was 3 steps behind Taiwo. Then others, drawn by the particular gravity of something happening that was not supposed to happen. From inside the compound, Amara's voice, trembling, not with fear, with something past fear, something that lives on the other side of all the emotions you have spent years armoring yourself against because they were never supposed to matter again. It is real, she said, to no one, to everyone. It is real. She was pregnant. Nobody knew how. She had not spoken of anyone. Had not spoken of wanting. Had perhaps, over 18 years of cooling soup and empty rooms, decided in some compartment of her body that was older than decision that waiting was still waiting, and that the body does not consult the mind about what it continues to hope for. Whatever the reason, Amara was pregnant. And Atana had begun to respond within the hour. The first sign was the cattle. 3 of the younger animals, not the oldest, not the ones already frail, lay down in the northern pasture and did not rise. Their eyes open. Their breathing shallow. The boy who tended them ran to the village shouting, and his shouting brought the elders from the council house, and the elders stood at the pasture's edge and looked at the animals and then looked at each other with expressions that Taiwo had no category for. It has begun, Bako said. His voice was completely flat. Not surprised. Not horrified. The voice of a man watching a thing he had always known would happen, when he had briefly dared to believe it would not. The second sign came from the Odin tree. The great Odin at the village center, still large, still ancient, still carrying the weight of the sky with the authority of something that had been rooted longer than anyone alive could remember, began to shed. Not branches this time. Bark. Strips of dark bark curling back from the trunk, falling to the base of the tree in slow, deliberate sheets. As though the tree were peeling itself. As though something were leaving it from the inside out. The young people of Atana, the ones in their 20s and early 30s who were young enough to remember nothing and old enough to understand what they were watching, began to gather at the tree. Standing back from it. Watching it lose itself. One of the young women, Yatund, 23 years old, all bright eyes and the barely controlled energy of someone whose life had not yet felt the full weight of the village she was born into, turned to look at Taiwo with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life. Not fear. Something stranger than fear. A kind of terrible, hungry awareness. The expression of someone who has been told their whole life that a door does not exist, and has just seen the door open. If she carries to term, Yatund said quietly, what will die? Nobody answered her. In Amara's compound, a lamp had been lit. Through the window, her shadow moved against the wall, back and forth, in the ancient, unconscious motion of a woman who is alone with something she cannot contain and cannot put down. The elders went to her. Taiwo did not follow. He stood at the base of the shedding Odin tree and watched the bark collect at his feet, and listened to the village, attempting to process its own impossibility. Around him, faces moved from the compound to the cattle to the tree, and back again, everyone calculating the same equation, everyone arriving at the same terrible result. A child, if it came, would cost Atana something enormous. Something irreplaceable. The mathematics had been exact before. A small life had cost small things. Zara, 5 days old and never truly present in the world, had taken 2 elders and a tree's strength and a herd's vitality. A child carried to full term, a child who lived a full life, who grew and reproduced and added decades and weight and years to the village's future, would cost proportionally. What did a full life cost, in the currency of Atana's bargain? The answer was somewhere in the stripping bark and the lying down cattle and the faces gathering in the thickening dark. Dunladi began his evening rounds early, and this time he did not move with the steady patience of a watchman doing his duty. He moved with the barely contained urgency of a man trying to hold something together with his bare hands that was already coming apart at every seam. Inside the council house, behind the closed door, the voices of elders rose and fell and could not agree. By midnight, the 3 cattle in the northern pasture had died. By the hour before dawn, 4 more had lain down. The Odin tree continued its slow, deliberate undressing. In the moonlight, the exposed wood beneath the bark was pale and smooth, like skin, like something that had never been meant to be seen. Mama Sua sat in Amara's compound through the night. Not as a healer. Not yet. Simply as a witness, the oldest kind of presence, the kind that says I will not look away from this, whatever it becomes. Amara had stopped moving by the deepest hour of the night. She sat in the center of her courtyard on a low stool, her hands folded across her abdomen in the simple, private way of women who have understood something about their own bodies. Her face, in the moonlight, was, Taiwo searched for the word and kept arriving at clear. Not peaceful. Not resolved. Clear. The way a sky is clear after a storm has passed and before the next one forms, temporarily, precisely free of obstruction. She knew what it would cost. The whole village knew what it would cost. The question that had been circling the village all night, settling and lifting and settling again like a bird that could not decide whether to land, was whether knowing was enough to stop it. Whether you could know the price of something and decide, consciously and with full information, not to pay it, or whether there were things the body decided independently of any counsel, any elder, any mathematics. Bako came to her compound before dawn. He stood at the threshold. He did not cross it. He was the oldest man in Atana, and his age sat on him fully now, all of its weight, all of the compressed memory of a man who had been 16 in a dying village and had made a choice and then spent 74 years determining whether the choice had been worth the cost, and had never arrived at a satisfying answer. He looked at Amara. She looked at him. Between them, the night air moved with the particular density of an unspoken conversation so full of competing truths that there was no room in it for words. "Tell me," Amara said finally. Her voice was quiet. "Tell me honestly what will happen." And Bako, who had controlled the story for 40 years, who had rehearsed the curse, who had sealed the doorways and tended the elders and maintained the bargain and woken each morning and chosen again and again and again the living over the not yet born, stood at her threshold and told her everything. He told her about the original elders, about the sickness, about the forest and the earth spirit, and the terms that had been accepted in exhaustion and terror, and the kind of hope that is indistinguishable from desperation. He told her about the balance, the mathematics, the way new life pulled old life out from under everything else, the way a thread unravels a weaving. He told her about Zara, and what Zara had cost, and how he had stood where he was standing now, and watched Amara carry her grief back into her compound afterward, alone, in the early morning of the 6th day. He told her that what she was carrying now, if it came to term, if it grew into a whole person, would cost the village something proportional to an entire human life. He did not know exactly what. He did not know whether it would be catastrophic or simply devastating. He knew it would not leave Atana unchanged. He told her that there were older women who knew certain herbs, certain preparations, certain ways to close a door that had opened unexpectedly. He told her this without asking her to use them. He was very careful not to ask. When he finished, Amara sat for a long time in the pre-dawn silence. The cattle sounds from the north were wrong, too quiet, the silence of animals no longer present to make noise. The Odin tree was a pale shape against the dark sky, stripped and strange and somehow more present for its vulnerability. "If I keep this child," Amara said slowly, "and the village suffers for it, the people who are here, the people who are alive and did not choose this, they bear the cost of my wanting." Bako said nothing. "And if I do not," she said, "then the village continues to survive itself to death, choosing survival over and over until there is nothing left to survive for." Bako said nothing. "You made that choice once," she said. Her voice was not accusing. It was something much harder to deflect than accusation. It was recognition. "How did you know it was the right one?" The oldest man in Atana stood at the threshold of the woman who had been waiting 18 years to ask him exactly that question, and he opened his mouth, and he closed it again. Behind him, the first gray light of morning was beginning to separate the sky from the land. Slowly. Irreversibly. The day arriving the way days always arrive, indifferent to whether anyone was ready for it. Taiwo watched from across the courtyard. His sleeping mat was still rolled under his arm. He had not gone back for it. He had stood through the dark hours listening and watching and trying to find, in the story he was collecting, the moment where someone was clearly right. He could not find it. He thought of Yatun's face at the Odin tree, the door-opening face, and he thought of the 8 kola-nut trees with their worn stones, and he thought of the cooling soup each morning, and the sealed doorways with their buried handprints, and the night watchman with his listening rounds, and a village that had organized itself so completely around loss that the loss had become infrastructure. He thought of the shedding tree. He thought of the cattle. He thought, there are decisions that cannot be made correctly. There are only decisions that can be made, and then lived with, and then passed forward to the next person who will have to live with them differently because the world they inherit will be shaped by the choice you made. Bako finally spoke. I did not know, he said. I was 16 years old, and I was afraid, and I did not know. He turned and walked back toward the council house. His shadow was very long in the gray light, stretched out behind him across the earth. In the compound, Amara's hands remained folded across her abdomen. She did not move. She did not decide. Or perhaps she had already decided, and was simply sitting with it before she let the world know. Holding the decision against herself for one more moment in the pre-dawn quiet, the way you hold the last of the fire's warmth before you step out into the cold morning air. The Odin tree continued its slow undressing. The cattle were silent in the north. Yatun stood somewhere in the village, awake, watching the sky pale. And Atana waited, as it had always waited, as it had been built to wait, for something it could not name, coming toward it from a direction it could not predict, in a future that may or may not be permitted to arrive. Some villages are remembered for what they built. Some are remembered for what they kept. Atana will be remembered, if it is remembered at all, for what it chose. And for the morning when one woman sat alone and held a choice that was also not entirely hers. And the morning did not tell her what to do. The morning just came. As it always does. Indifferent. Luminous. Unresolved.